As I mentioned before, the root chondro means cartilage and the root endo means within. So literally, a process that's named endochondral ossification is the process that we have bone formation, ossification, within a cartilage model. And that's literally what happens. And this endochondral ossification process happens basically in all bones that are below our skull, with the exception of the clavicle. So how does this start? What happens is that we have the mesenchymal skeletal cells. And then these cells receive signals that they should arrange themselves in a way that has the shape of a bone, but when they're doing that, they should differentiate into chondroblasts. And chondroblasts, as the name implies, chondro means cartilage, and blasts are the cells that are born to build whatever was before. So the chondroblasts are the cells born to build cartilage. Now, besides these mesenchymal skeletal cells getting the signal that they should arrange themselves in a bone shape and differentiate into chondroblasts, they also get the signal that they should differentiate into cells that surround, that are at the periphery of these chondroblasts. And since these cells are at the periphery of the chondroblasts, we call them the perichondrium, because the root peri means periphery, and chondrium makes a reference that we are talking about cartilage. Consequently, the perichondrium is at the periphery of where we find the chondroblasts, which are the cells born to build cartilage. And together, the perichondrium and the chondroblasts form the cartilage model. And this cartilage model consists specifically of hyaline cartilage, which is the most abundant type of cartilage we find in our body. And this cartilage model has the general shape of the future bone that will be formed by endochondral ossification. So the bone formation will happen within this cartilage model. And with that being said, you can conclude that the first step in the endochondral ossification is the development of the cartilage model. Now, after we have the cartilage model, what happens? We have this cartilage model growing. So obviously, the second step of endochondral ossification is the growth of the cartilage model. And this cartilage model grows in length and also in width. And this happens due to two different reasons. Growing in length, we have the chondroblasts, which are within this cartilage model, secreting extracellular matrix. And then these chondroblasts get stuck within this extracellular matrix. They mature into chondrocytes, which are the cells that we find in the cartilage. And as these chondrocytes proliferate, we have the cartilage model increasing in length. Now, at the same time this is happening, we have mesenchymal cells within the perichondrium differentiating into new chondroblasts. And these new chondroblasts, they are deposited at the edge of the previous chondroblasts that were formed. And they also secrete extracellular matrix. And since these new chondroblasts are deposited at the edge, they cause the bone to increase in thickness. So they cause the increase in width of the cartilage model that is giving rise to the future bone. Now, these chondrocytes right here, in the middle of the cartilage model, they are multiplying, and we have this extracellular matrix that they are immersed into. And then the extracellular matrix starts to get calcified. And as it gets calcified, it gets hard. And then it becomes more difficult for nutrients to diffuse through this extracellular matrix that is now calcified. And with that, the chondrocytes cannot receive nutrients, and they end up dying. And when they die, they leave empty spaces within this cartilage model. And when this happens, another phase of the endochondral ossification starts. And since it starts at the center of the cartilage model, we call that the development of the primary ossification center, because it started at the center where we had the chondrocytes dying. And the third phase, the development of the primary ossification center, is characterized by blood vessels going through the perichondrium and reaching the middle of the cartilage model. And when these blood vessels, they go and reach the middle, like the center right here where we had the empty spaces due to the death of the chondrocytes, the perichondrium gets the signal that, okay, now we can start differentiating into real bone cells. And then we have mesenchymal cells within the perichondrium differentiating into osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts are the cells born to build bone. And they follow this pathway that the blood vessels went through, and these osteoblasts derived from the mesenchymal cells in the perichondrium go all the way to the center of this cartilage model, and that is what we call the development of the primary ossification center. Now, as soon as these mesenchymal cells in the perichondrium start differentiating into osteoblasts instead of chondroblasts, we don't call the perichondrium anymore. Now we call it periosteum, which is the layer of cells at the periphery, that gives rise to cells that will become bone. And when we look at these osteoblasts at the primary ossification center, we see that they start depositing extracellular matrix on top of the calcified extracellular matrix that was there. And remember, we had gaps between that cartilage extracellular matrix because the chondrocytes were dying due to being deprived to nutrients. So now we have the bone extracellular matrix deposited on top of the cartilage extracellular matrix, and there are gaps in between that. Consequently, we have at this point the formation of the sponge, because it looks like a sponge bone trabeculae at the center of the cartilage model. And as time passes, this primary ossification that was exactly at the center starts spreading to the sides, to the edges of this cartilage model. Now, as the primary ossification center starts moving towards the edges of the cartilage model, another cell comes into play. And this other cell is the osteoclast. And as you learned from before, a osteoclast is a cell that crushes bone. And when we have the osteoclasts taking action, we start having the destruction of the spongy bone that was created here in the primary ossification center. And when we have the destruction of this spongy bone trabeculae, it leaves a cavity, an open space in that area. And this cavity is what we call medullary cavity. And the development of the medullary cavity is the fourth step in the endochondral ossification. And then as the medullary cavity is being formed, we have the primary ossification center moving towards the ends of the bones. And consequently, if at the ends of the bones we did not have ossification yet, this is still cartilage. And specifically, what type of cartilage? Hyaline cartilage. And then what happens is that we have an artery piercing through this end of the bone, and another artery piercing through this end of the bone, going to the two ends of the bone. And the name we give for the ends of a bone is epiphysis. And since anatomists are not creative, the name of these arteries that pierce the epiphysis of the bone is epiphyseal artery. So we have an epiphyseal artery piercing through each epiphysis of the bone, and when these arteries are there at the epiphysis, they branch, and then they are capable of delivering nutrients to that area. That serves as a code for the periosteum to make cells that will give rise to bone, so osteoblasts, and then these right here start becoming bone. Now, these epiphyses are becoming bone after the primary ossification center. So this ossification at the epiphysis are called secondary ossification centers. And consequently, you can conclude that the fifth step in endochondral ossification is the development of the secondary ossification centers. In the epiphysis, bone formation will happen basically the same way as it happened for the primary ossification center, but besides having the spongy bone trabeculae being destroyed as it happened before, in the epiphysis that doesn't happen. We have the blood vessels in the epiphysis, and surrounding the blood vessels, we would find the spongy bone trabeculae, and it remains there the entire time. Now, as you can see, we have the spongy bone trabeculae at the epiphysis of the bone. We do not have spongy bone trabeculae in this middle part of the bone, in between the two epiphyses. And this middle part that we are seeing between the two epiphyses is the part of the bone that makes the dialogue between the two epiphyses. And that's how you remember that this middle part is called diaphysis. So each bone has two epiphyses and a diaphysis in the middle. Now, if you look closely here at the epiphysis, you can see that even though the secondary ossification happened there, we still have hyaline cartilage left at the edge of the epiphysis and also in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And this region in between the epiphysis and diaphysis, right here, is what we call metaphysis. So M for metaphysis, M for middle. Metaphysis is in the middle, is in between the epiphysis and diaphysis. And in the metaphysis, we find this hyaline cartilage plate. And this hyaline cartilage plate receives the name of growth plate or epiphyseal plate. And with the name of growth plate, you can conclude that this specific plate is what allows our long bones to grow in length. And we'll be talking more about that pretty soon. Now, I said that we have hyaline cartilage left in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis in a place called metaphysis, and also that we had hyaline cartilage left at the edges of the epiphysis. And this hyaline cartilage left in the edges of the epiphysis, it becomes articular cartilage. And with this name of articular cartilage, you can conclude that this hyaline cartilage left at the edge of the epiphysis is the hyaline cartilage found in the articulations between two bones. Now, keeping this in mind, you can conclude that if the fifth step of the endochondral ossification was the development of the secondary ossification centers, the next step is the formation of the articular cartilage and also the formation of the growth plate. So, as a summary, what are the 6 steps of endochondral ossification? Number 1, formation of a cartilage model. Number 2, growth of the cartilage model. Number 3, primary ossification center development. Number 4, the formation of the medullary cavity. Number 5, the development of the secondary ossification center. And finally, number 6, the formation of the articular cartilage and the growth plate. Now, let's finish this part by looking at the growth plate. We already defined that the growth plate is a plate of hyaline cartilage found at the metaphysis. And the metaphysis is in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. It turns out that if we zoom in this growth plate, what we would see is chondrocytes, because this is cartilage, and the cells we find in cartilage are chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage. Now, it turns out that the chondrocytes that are close to the edge, to the epiphysis, they keep dividing, giving rise to new chondrocytes. And the chondrocytes that are close to the diaphysis, they are close to where the primary ossification center was. And that's a way you do to remember that the chondrocytes that are closer to where the primary ossification center was, they become bone. So in these chondrocytes that are close to the diaphysis, what happens is that the extracellular matrix around them gets calcified. If the extracellular matrix gets calcified, they cannot receive nutrients, and then they die, and then the osteoclasts come, crush that thing up, and then osteoblasts come, and they build bone. The osteoblast will start secreting the bone extracellular matrix, and that specific spot will become bone. So we have the formation of bone in the side of the plate that's closer to the diaphysis, and we have the formation of more cartilage in the side of the growth plate that's closer to the epiphysis. And when this happens, you can conclude that we keep having cartilage on this side of the growth plate, and we are having bone forming in this side of the growth plate. And when this happens, we have our bones growing in length. Now, when we have these cells right here in the epiphyseal side of the growth plate stopping, giving rise to new chondrocytes, then eventually these will all turn into bone, and we'll have something that is like a scar tissue, basically, that looks like a line right there. When this becomes a line, we call it epiphyseal line. And if we have a line, we do not have chondrocytes multiplying, proliferating, giving rise to new chondrocytes. And consequently, we don't have this process happening. And if we don't have this process happening, our bones stop growing in length, and consequently, we stop growing in length.